What is it called? I mean, is it Spotify framework? Whether it's a Spotify model or it's a tool? What do we call or what do we refer it as?
So I think this depends a little bit on who you talk to. So if you talk to people out in the wild, you will probably get answers that match all three of those. If you talk to people who do or have worked at Spotify, they may describe it as anything from doesn't exist, I haven't seen it, or maybe just how we work.
Since we are talking about Spotify, obviously there would be some sorts of measures of doing or measuring our success on, right? So beyond just a traditional KPI, I mean, how does Spotify measure success within its squad? What are some unique metrics that they use?
I saw all variety of things in my time there. The things that I like most are the things that are closest to the thing that the customer cares about. So if you can get to a point where you're measuring some kind of meaningful impact to a customer, internal or external customer, right?
Raise your hand if the Spotify model sounds like some code word whispered by successful companies, but you have no clue where to even begin. You are not alone. This framework throws around terms like squads and chapters, leaving many of us scratching our heads wondering, how do I actually make this work in my team? Don't worry, we have got your back. This episode, that is Spotify Model 101, is for those who are curious but confused, ready to work on this framework but not sure where to start. To help you all, today we have Cliff Hazell as our guest, who has lived and breathed Spotify model in Spotify organization. Cliff is a keynote speaker, trainer, writer, and co-founder of Flight Level Academy. Over the course of 2 decades, he has made a career out of breaking down the obstacles that stand in the way of great work. He challenges the status quo in the quest to develop the right culture and systems for the creation of excellent companies and products. So, without further ado, let's welcome Cliff Hazell.
Hello, Cliff. Welcome to the podcast by Agile Coaching Roundtable. It's a great pleasure having you on our show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here with both of you. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, so today we want to have a conversation with you on the topic Spotify model or framework. We know that you have worked extensively on Spotify model and in Spotify company. So we want to have like personal learning from you on this Spotify thing. So we thought who better than you to learn from, right? So today we want to talk everything about Spotify. So for just considering that our listeners are beginners in this Spotify thing, so basis that we would want to have a conversation with you. So to begin with, first thing that I want to understand is what is it called? I mean, is it Spotify framework? Whether it's a Spotify model or it's a tool? What do we call or what do we refer it as?
So I think this depends a little bit on who you talk to. So if you talk to people out in the wild, you will probably get answers that match all three of those. If you talk to people who do or have worked at Spotify, they may describe it as anything from doesn't exist, I haven't seen it, or maybe just how we work, if that makes sense. I think what I find interesting is how often people look at what was described in the papers and the articles that have been published, and I've written some of my own thoughts about this as well, and they assume that everything is kind of exactly how it's described on paper. The reality is that the company was always evolving. When I joined, there were only 700 people. When I left, there were 5,000 people. This was 4.5 years. And the way that we worked when I started was not exactly the same as how we worked by the time I left. The point is basically that everything is constantly evolving. And I think we can unpack some of the specifics and talk about specific aspects of the things that people have thought about as the model. But I think the first thing to say is basically that we must acknowledge that it didn't represent 100% of the company. Different people have had different experiences depending on where they worked and how they worked. But what I would say is that the vast majority of the areas that I worked in, we did have something that looked like a squad, something that was pretty much a chapter or a guild or a tribe. But really, those things I actually think are almost the least interesting part of the model.
Oh.
And the reason for this is that for the most part, they're really just a name for a concept that we already know. So a chapter is just a matrix function, and there's places where that may help and maybe where it's not so helpful. A tribe is not that different from a department or a sort of mission-led area. And a squad is mostly an autonomous kind of direction, focused team. So yeah, I'm happy to talk about this and explore it a little bit more, but I think some of that nuance at the beginning is worth to just kind of set the tone a little bit. I'm definitely not going to stand here and say, yes, you should go out and buy the Spotify model. Although I do think that you can learn a lot from talking to folks who have spent time working there and finding out interesting things from the lessons that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and definitely we will talk more about the breakdown of the Spotify model, the maybe the tribes, the chapters, and all those things. But before we get into that, maybe would you like to talk more about your journey exploring the Spotify model and what excites you about the model altogether?
Yeah. So I want to reframe the question slightly, if that's okay, because my journey starts long before Spotify in product management. I was head of product at a telco in South Africa, where I'm originally from. I'd done a couple of other things along that journey beforehand, but basically the thing that I was constantly noticing was that we have this strong tendency to try to decide things at a point where we don't yet know the answer. And for some reason, we seem quite uncomfortable with waiting until we know more. And so we decide now. And often people call this like waterfall projects or something like this. This is one variation of it. But I think even in an agile way of working, quite often we make commitments really quite early before we know what's going on. And so what I found from that work experience pre-Spotify was, how can we make better decisions about when do we actually make the decision, if that makes sense? So rather than deciding everything up front when we know the least, we can't necessarily wait until the end either. At some point, we have to make a decision without knowing all the answers. But can we maybe de-risk it and explore a little bit? So, run a sprint, have a test, write the thing down, maybe have a hypothesis, draw it on a whiteboard, something like this, just to get to a point where, like, okay, can we think from step 1, step 2, step 3, okay, then the result? Because often we've missed those middle steps, and I think, we can explore that a bit. So that's kind of the start of the journey. Post Spotify, I've been working with a bunch of scale-ups and startups. I've spent most of my time coaching leaders at fast-growing companies, basically helping them through some of the stuff from the prior experience in product, the time at Spotify, and what I've learned, not just from chatting to folks like you, but also from hanging out with other people, learning from their ideas, hearing their talks, and so on. In terms of Spotify specifically, I think one of the things, and I had a relatively popular post on LinkedIn about last week sometime. I posted my 4 reflections on my time at Spotify. And the first thing that I pointed out was that really what happens a lot of the time is that people kind of see it from the outside. They see this company that's done well, and they assume that everything is like magic and ponies on the inside. It's all great. Spotify had problems. Every company has problems. And basically, the thing that I put forward is that I think it's worth taking some time to understand what kind of problems does a company have, because that leads you to understand the solutions that they've applied. So if we have, a certain type of problem, in Sweden, it snows a lot, right? So we build houses that are really warm. In South Africa, where I grew up, we don't build houses the same way because it's usually 35 degrees. The consequence of that is that it's really quite nice and comfortable in the heat. It sucks in the cold. Sweden has the opposite problem. If it's super hot, it's really uncomfortable, but when it's super cold, it's actually quite nice and warm indoors. And so this kind of illustrates a little bit of the difference that you're playing with. If you build a Swedish house in South Africa, I think you're going to be uncomfortable quite a lot of the time. And certainly if you did it the other way around, you would be uncomfortable the vast majority of the time. So yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question at all. It's a little bit of a roundabout way just to say that there's a lot of variation. And I think really the most important thing for me to do or to say is that if anyone's looking at this kind of stuff, try to understand first what is the problem that you want to solve, And if you get clear on that, then you should be able to draw some kind of a line between, okay, this problem can be solved by that solution. And so then we can explore a little bit further.
Wow, that's an interesting journey, I would say. And since you're talking about solving the problems, right? So just imagine that if I have to ask you to maybe break down the Spotify model or solve problems using Spotify model for us. So what would that look like? I mean, what are the core principles of Spotify model? I'm sure, I mean, the way we have the core principles and values of, say, Agile, or maybe even for Scrum, we have values. So I'm sure there would be some core values or principles for Spotify. So if you have to break down Spotify model for us, and if you have to talk about, say, some core values or principle, and how does those differ from traditional structures, what would that be?
So again, I would say it changed a little bit at different points. When I first joined the company, and I would just say internally at Spotify, people didn't talk about Spotify as having a model. It was more just like we talk. I mean, it sort of maybe sounds a bit strange, but it's like, this is how we work and this is how we work in that area. It was just kind of how the conversation happened. But one of the key things over the time that I was there that was really quite important was this idea of trying to be able to be responsive or fast. And there's a lot of detail to unpack around what does that mean. But really, I think the idea was primarily to say, how can we go from something that we have an idea on over here to something that is out there that people can use? Because it doesn't matter if we have an idea, if we can't put it in front of people and then see how well they use it, what happens as a result, then we don't learn. A lot of the time we have these great ideas, we draw it on a whiteboard, and then you try to do it in real life. It turns out, real life has other ideas. And the same is true whether you think about building the product or about building the organization internally. So a lot of it was, how can we give, the person as close to the problem as possible the ability to make the decision around what happens. So the idea that, the CEO would be sitting there going, make the button green, I don't think this makes a lot of sense. But, this wasn't something that I saw happening. So yeah, there's a lot of things to unpack there, but really, I think a lot of the time it's about saying, how can we give a team a meaningful problem to solve, the freedom to make the decisions, and also the information that they need in order to make consistently good decisions around what they're doing. And sometimes that might be that they need to talk to different people or get other info or get more, just access to certain things. So that was kind of the overarching, principle, if you will. Certainly the way that I saw most of the behavior of the leadership team and folks within the organization. That was something that we were trying to do.
Mm-hmm. And while you were explaining about it, you definitely spoke about teams multiple times. And then when we are into Spotify, obviously there are definitely squads, there are definitely chapters. And I also understand or know it's not a good way to say them as an independent unit. Obviously, the squads and the chapters together work together to build up something together as a bigger picture. How does the shared ownership empower them when working within a squad and as a chapter?
I think there's a couple of different factors there. So for me, the purpose of a cross-functional team having kind of shared ownership for something, the idea is that if we need somebody from marketing in order to be able to ship this product, if they're in another team, we're going to always have to have a coordination or scheduling conversation to say, hey, I need your help on something. At some point, you say, okay, well, if we need them once every year, maybe we don't put them in the team. We need them once a month. I don't know, maybe they come to our quarterly plan. If we need them every day, maybe they sit next to us. You can do all of this without necessarily having people change reporting lines or anything like this, although in some cases you might also change that. But I think this kind of thing is interesting to think through. And I think very often what I see people doing is making decisions about org design, mostly from the perspective of management. And I want to be careful because I don't think that management problems are irrelevant to solve. But if we only solve the manager's problems and we don't solve also the team's problems and the people who are kind of going to experience the consequences of some of these choices, we end up with a situation where we say, okay, well, the manager wants everybody all in one team, but actually we don't have anything to do with each other. you work on something totally different and unrelated to me. Now I'm sitting in your stand-up talking about your work that, I mean, I like you, you're nice, and it's technically interesting, but it doesn't really affect my life other than the social side of things. And so I think there's a lot of questions to kind of unpack a little bit about how do you want to go about this. But the first and most important thing for me is that we want to make these decisions with more perspectives than just one. I don't want only the manager deciding on this, although they may ultimately have responsibility for the end decision. We should probably talk to a few of the other people and see how does it affect them? What problems do they see? Where are the pain points that they're finding? Let's explore that a little bit. So I don't know, is this answering your question a little bit?
Yes, yes. And while you were answering this, there were, so many things that came to my mind since you're talking about, say, decision making, right? Unlike traditional ways wherein a manager call the shot saying that, you know what, this is your team and this is how you should be, or this is your org structure. And what I understand from you is that maybe I love the idea when you said that, for an example, if you want to talk to a marketing people and then if you have to interact very frequently or maybe on the daily basis, you might as well have them sit next to you and try to solve problems. Right? So that's an interesting take. So to get to that point, there would be a lot of autonomy that we need to give to the teams and a lot of decision making that we need to transfer to the teams or maybe squads or whatever we may call, right? So in that case, how is Spotify model enabling to decentralize this decision making? And second thing is, are there any trade-offs while doing this?
So I think there are definite trade-offs in autonomy, and I think that's a lot of the reasons why people don't often lean into it. I think many cases there is also some fears that hold people back. If I don't know that you're going to do a good job, it's a little bit easier for me to feel comfortable giving responsibility to you. And similarly, if you're delegating something to me and you know that you're probably going to have to redo it anyway. In many cases, you might feel, well, it's easier if I just do it the first time. So I think this is something that we have to kind of overcome. And I think there's several different factors inside that. But really, I think that a lot of the time, it's about being able to have a healthy conversation between the people who are involved. And often what we've done, I think, is skip over some of the alignment conversations and just kind of jumped straight in and said, okay, let's start working. And I see this in a variety of different contexts, whether you're working with a Scrum team or even, with the CEO of a company and their immediate team. Meeting happens, we say, okay, cool, we're all agreed, we're aligned. And I'll just kind of, sorry, can you just take 2 seconds, just write down in Slack or on a post-it note or something, what are the things that you understand that we've agreed in this meeting? And then you just compare notes and have a look. And the number of times that it's exactly the same thing in my life has been maybe once.
Yes.
In 25,000 times I've tried this. Most of the time, you start to notice something like, it can be quite extreme. It can be, I think we should go left, and you thought that we should go right. Okay, well, maybe we should talk about that because we thought we were in agreement. And I think that a lot of the point of like this autonomy thing is that people kind of think of alignment maybe incorrectly as it's an activity that you do once at the beginning of the quarter, or you do once at the beginning of the year. You say, right, now we're aligned. Putting aside whether or not you were even aligned from that conversation, because as I illustrated, I think it's often the case of not. What we often need to do is take a sort of a loop on that and say, okay, but now we've done this thing, or now we've uncovered something, or now we've learned something, and that maybe affects. And we're all learning and going in slightly different directions. We need that point to just kind of reconnect back and say, okay, where are we? And this connects kind of nicely to what we were talking about before. How often does that need to be? Is it something we can do once a year, like maybe with a budget? And even in the case of a budget, I would say probably you want to do it actually more than once a year. Or is it more like the conversation with marketing where we said maybe it's every day or once a week or something like that? And I think there's a lot of interesting tools for being able to unpack this and figure out how that works. But The most common mistake that I see people making is giving teams autonomy without actually working on the alignment and without working on the information that they need to make good decisions. And part of that information is, the alignment around what actually is the goal and what's the purpose, where we're trying to get to, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I completely align to what you said, Cliff, because giving autonomy without having an alignment is, I think, is maybe you are doing more harm to the team, just by giving autonomy without having certain alignment or without having certain direction towards where they need to move.
Yeah, I think very often, I don't know if you've ever heard this. I've heard company leadership or various departments kind of talking about like, oh, the strategy was great, we just couldn't execute it. And I kind of see this as actually shining a light sort of back at them, because if you defined a strategy that you couldn't execute, then you didn't define a good strategy by definition. And there's things in the space, like you could unpack a lot of details behind that, but really what we're trying to do with alignment is get to a point where we're saying, okay, we think that it makes sense to go in this direction, and here are the things that we as each individual or each team, each department or whatever can contribute to making that thing more impactful. And yeah, there's a lot of detail often to unpack there. But I think, as I already said, the point is that we need to have that conversation on different timescales. Once a year, we probably need to align on some things, once a quarter, maybe every few weeks, every few months. And in some details, it's going to be changing every day. And you have to figure that out, because you can't keep everyone in the loop on every detail 24/7. That doesn't help either. You won't have any time to do any work. You'll just be in meetings to hear status updates the whole time.
It's correct. And what I also, something coming to my mind when we are talking about aligning people before giving the autonomy, right? So I think one of the ways that I can think of right now is maybe having working agreements in place, right? I mean, what are we trying to do, or how are we going to align on certain things? So maybe having a working agreements on how are we going to be going about certain things might help over here in such a setup wherein we say that everyone is, free to choose their teams, or maybe where we give a lot of autonomy, right? So having the balance over here, I mean, how much autonomy to be given versus what alignments are we going to have, right? So maybe working agreement can work over here. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was just going to say on that is that I think very often something like a working agreement, what I find is helpful in that space is to try to surface kind of the conversation around, what are the things that you would need in order to perform your best within this organization. And that could be within the context of a team, or, like as in a single squad, like software development team, or it could be in the bigger context of something in Spotify language, like a tribe or something. And I think what's interesting with that is to try to put forward the things that would cause, people to feel totally disempowered or demotivated, or they would really struggle with. And parallel to that, there's a little bit of a conversation to say, okay, so let's say, for example, we're working on something that is very, it's super cutting edge. We don't know exactly what we're doing. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty, a lot of change. Some people love that kind of work, and so they're well suited to it. They're going to be happy in that space. Other people are much more like, I want to polish the thing. I want to make it very stable, very structured, very disciplined, very consistent. And I just paint sort of as two kind of extremes. There's a lot of variance in between. But if we, try to put those people who are more comfortable kind of iterating on making something really, really polished in a space where it's highly cutting edge and innovative, or vice versa, both sides are going to get frustrated. And so I have this phrase that I can't remember where I got it from, but I heard this thing of, if you want people to do a good job, you need to give them a good job to do.
Yes, correct.
And so I like this, because I think that's part of what it's about. It's around aligning on a good opportunity, but also giving people something that is appropriate for their skills, their interests, where they want to learn and evolve and develop. And yeah, I think it's a hard question at times, but it's one that I think we can engage with. Yeah.
Yeah. And since we are talking about teams and maybe teams beyond a certain set of teams, and my next question is definitely about scaling to beyond a certain level, right? And I also understand that scaling at times, or not at times, often, most of the time, it's a trickier and the challenging thing to do. How does Spotify ensure, over here, the alignment part and also avoiding a silo kind of an way of operating? And definitely, what are certain potential pitfalls over here as well?
So I would say that this is something that's constantly evolving, and I can talk about it maybe easier from an example of some recent clients that I've worked with. The thing that I think is interesting here is that there's partly a thing of saying, well, what are we aligning around? Is it a product? Is it a value stream? Is it a set of components? Is it around hiring people? What is it that we're doing here? And very often, once we can get clear on that, I think a lot of the challenges that people face down the line, they start to be a little bit easier to solve. Because if you're doing something that doesn't relate to this thing, well, why is it here? Like, the purpose of this group is to solve this customer problem, or to ship that product, or something like this. The second thing I think is about trying to figure out at what level are we trying to have that conversation. And there's two kind of schools of thinking, and I say them as different things, but I think they actually largely align. The first one is the metaphor of flight levels that my friend Klaus Leopold has been talking about for quite a few years. The metaphor is quite simple. If you fly close to the ground, you see a lot of detail, but you don't really see so wide and so broad. If you fly high, you see quite far. You can see maybe over the mountains even, and round some corners, that kind of a thing. But you don't have the detail from the bottom. And in the middle, you have kind of more this sort of coordination, connecting the dots together kind of space. And so often what I find is that we're facing challenges, for example, at the team level, where the team is saying, hey, I know you have, in theory, one backlog, but in actual fact, I've got one from marketing, one from customer support, one from HR, one from finance, one from that product team, one from this other area, one from a third-party company. At the end of the day, because nobody has given us some kind of way to sequence that, we're doing the best that we can with the information we have available. And so, I picked this one, but in reality, somebody else has picked this other one, and now we have conflict with each other. So this kind of problem, I would say you solve this more at flight level 2 in the coordination space. Between multiple teams, we can get groups of people together and say, which of these things that we're working on is more important for the whole group across the group. So we can have one single number one for the entire area. We can then repeat that pattern again at the strategy level and say, given this view of the current landscape and the direction we're heading in, are we going to prioritize the thing in my left hand or the thing in my right hand? Which one gets to go first, basically, when we have limitations? So quite simply, if I need both of you to help on something, one of you is on number 1, the other one's on number 2, and I'm asking for your help on number 3, you should probably both say to me, sorry, dude, we're on something higher up. But Ramya, if you're working on number 1 and you want Vivek to help you with something, he should switch from number 2 and help you with number 1, because number 1 has been put at the top. So this is the first kind of set of metaphors in the flight level space. And the other piece comes from, I don't know if you've read the book Team Topologies. In this space, they have a cool set of metaphors for understanding different types of teams, which I would overlay with flight levels and say, what type of team are we building? And then what type of interaction, or API, as they call it kind of in the software world, what kind of interaction model do we need between the teams? So my relationship between you and I is that more you're acting as a service to me, like I ask you for, please hire me one of these, or please buy me one of those, an IT support sort of thing. Or is it much more, you build an analytics tool and maybe you build something that is actually enabling what I do. So that interaction model would be different. Or maybe it is actually, well, we work together to solve a product problem. You're in marketing, I'm in IT, and we build parts and sell parts of the same product. And so I think we can have a much more meaningful conversation when we use tools like this to figure out first at which level are we solving the problem, and then try to build those connections between the different teams. And so that's kind of how I think about it. And I mean, I've been using some of this from before Spotify. I used it a lot at Spotify, and I've certainly been using it since as well. So, yeah.
So I have one very a different question, or maybe a curious question, or just to understand when you're talking about flight levels, is it some kind of a mechanism or some kind of a tool, or is it a concept that you're referring to?
If I oversimplify it a lot, if you think about inside a single team, you've got a group of, say, 5 to 10 people who work together on something. And what you've done is you've visualized the things that they work on. I'm basically taking that pattern, or what we do with flight levels is take that pattern and repeat it and say, okay, so we're not talking about individual humans, we're talking about teams. So if we want these 10 teams to work together, let's visualize the things that they work on that span across the teams. So it might be something like projects or initiatives, epics, something like this. And then again, we're doing this at the strategy level of the company and saying across departments, across products, across P&L, across whatever it is, we have a set of things that are, sort of the bigger chunks or the longer range kind of things that bind those teams together. And so we would say, okay, if we want to launch in Egypt, for example, there's things that we have to do in IT. There's stuff we need to do in HR. There's things we need to do in legal. There's things that you might need to negotiate the rights for music in that country. Maybe you want to hire a team there and build up a local ground support office. All of these kind of things. So the bigger goal cascades kind of into sort of smaller sets. But the thing that's important is that it's not necessarily a hierarchical flow. People often conflate this stuff, like they mix it up with dictating. It doesn't mean that the top person tells the person below. If I say, hey, we want to launch in Egypt, I'm asking the other people, what would you need to do in order for us to launch in Egypt? And so they can come up with a set of things, and then for level 2, and then similarly, you could do that down to level 1. Say, if I want to translate this app for launching in Egypt, we probably have to support Arabic languages, for example, which means reading in the other direction to what English languages are used to. And so, there's got some implications for UI design. It's got implications for the software. There's translation things. Okay, so we would have to do this and this in this team, some other things in another team, that kind of a thing. And so this is more how I would think about that kind of relationship and conversation. And so it's involving a little bit more of everybody in the conversation, rather than just the 3 people at the top making all the decisions. Everybody else has to try to figure it out later. Let's have a bit of that conversation while we're discussing, like, how would it look before we start?
Wow, this is very interesting. I mean, I could visualize what you were trying to say. When you said that we have set of teams working on certain thing, and then we have another set of teams that they are working on something else, and we try to align on from the top level. We are trying to align on things. Maybe if you want to say, as you mentioned, I mean, if you want to introduce something at, say, in the country Egypt, so how are we going to realign ourselves to fit to that requirement, right? So what I understand, this is from the, say, if you want to launch a product in say new country. So my question is something for, say, service based industries or service based organizations. Not necessarily they will have a product, but they would be providing services to the different customers. And imagine that, say, they are dealing with, say, 5 customers at a time in an organization, and their ask and needs are different for all 5 customers. So how are we trying? I'm just trying to wrap my head around. I mean, how are we going to have these team formations or kind of a thing in line with the Spotify over here? And how are we going to realign? Because or how are we going to even treat this as? I mean, are we trying to treat this as a value stream, or a separate product altogether, or maybe a project? I mean, one project, one customer, or how are we going to align around these 4 to 5 customers?
I think in service-based organizations, there's usually some kind of reason why the teams are collaborating. It's either, we work together on the same customer. It could be maybe that you have some kind of I don't know, like a shared product or service that is used by multiple customers, something along those lines. It could be knowledge sharing. So we all have the same kind of skill set, although we work with different customers. Or the final one that I've seen is that this kind of form of actually what we're trying to do is build a product or a suite of products that we can then take from this customer and actually also sell it to another customer, which is maybe a little bit different to knowledge sharing, but not entirely different. I think the question is like, what do you want to try to optimize for in that organization? So often, especially if you're like a consulting company, for example, for a lot of people, they might say, just I'm simplifying it, but let's say you work 4 days a week with clients and 1 day a week internally. What you've done there is you've optimized mostly for the client, right? So that makes sense because that's how you're spending your time. It's where your money comes from. But you've now made it a little bit harder to collaborate maybe internally or to find the time. So how are you going to do that? Well, I mean, there's a lot of different things that you could explore, but I think first it's a case of getting clear on what is the thing you're trying to optimize for and understanding the consequences and trade-offs of that approach. If you want to make the customers happy first, that means internally you're going to be less happy, and that's probably a consequence. And as long as you're happy with that, that's cool. But if you try to say, well, both of them have to be equal, well, 4-to-1 doesn't really make it equal. So you might have to shift it around. I'm just talking about day allocation, but even like your team structures. I go out and I work by myself with this client. What container for collaboration is there where I can share my ideas or knowledge back to you? Do we do some sort of lunch and learns? Do we have a Slack channel? Do I make a presentation every now and again? Do I document my ideas? Like, how do we share this information so that we can have that flow? And I think it's worth figuring out. I would again look perhaps at some of the flight level stuff or at the team topology stuff and say, what kind of patterns could be useful for this? I do think it's solvable, but it's a different way of thinking about it. And I probably wouldn't, not probably, I almost definitely wouldn't build the same kind of organizational structure for something like a high-tech sort of innovation-heavy Spotify type startup versus maybe a bank or an insurance company or a consulting company that does much more like service-based delivery. It makes sense that you would organize differently because you do different things, you optimize for different things. So
yes, I mean, while you were talking about this thing, right? I mean, we need to certainly see, I mean, at what level we are coming together, whether it is a product level or maybe it's a customer level or maybe it's so what clicked me is, so since we are talking about, say, service based in organizations where they are into consulting, right? So typically what they merge on is the domains. For an example, the organization would be, say, very big or maybe at mid-level organizations, and they would be having some multiple domains that they are working on, right? So they would have people from one domain work together and make it as a one department. Maybe they'll say basis the domain, they'll say this is one department, this is another department. So maybe within the domain or department is where we can apply this Spotify, wherein maybe under that domain there could be, say, multiple clients that they're handling or multiple solutions that they're offering as a consultants. So maybe at a domain level is where they can do this Spotify, wherein they brainstorm, okay, these are different clients that we are catering to, and okay, for this client we have applied so and so things, and maybe it could be similar since the domain is same. Similar kind of solutions could be applied. So instead of reinventing the wheel, you might as well use whatever we have already done and optimize those things, and maybe share that knowledge across or populate those knowledge across other customers or clients or projects that we are working in within that domain. So maybe at least to some extent we can do that Spotify thing at a domain level or a BU level, but not definitely, as you rightly mentioned, not at the scale at which Spotify would be doing right from the top till the bottom, because it's a product based, and maybe we are going on adding features or maybe things and expanding across the countries. Because as you rightly mentioned, I mean, it could be a bit different for the consulting organizations where the way they are operating or the way they are servicing their customers would be different. So maybe it could be applied in department or domains, but not at right from the top till bottom, the Spotify would be applicable. What do you think? I mean, am I making sense on this?
I think so. I think you're right in that there's different levels at which these things might apply differently. And the question that I would ask is or suggest that you try to answer is, what is the problem that you're trying to solve in each of those contexts? So, as an example, if you have a problem with maybe some sort of knowledge sharing between groups, sure, maybe something kind of like a guild or whatever, this kind of thing. But I mean, a guild, a center of excellence, like a community of practice, these are all really the same thing in my mind. They're just different labels. Build something like this, probably makes some sense, but also understand that there's a lot of energy that goes into building a community of practice, and there's probably a lot of tools and kind of effort that has to be invested to do it well. So yeah, I think the thing is to try to find the firstly understand the problem that you want to solve. And once you're clear on that, then look for maybe a couple of different options of different solutions. And yeah, based on that, I think usually I find if people can't come up with 3 possible ways to solve a problem, they haven't really thought it through enough. If you've only got one answer, you've come up with a solution and then you've looked for a problem usually, rather than the other way around. So I like to say, I got this from a guy by the name of Jerry Weinberg, who, yeah, I was lucky to spend some time with him many years ago while he was still alive. But he had this thing called the rule of 3, and he said, always come up with 3. He used it in a number of different cases, but in this case, come up with 3 solutions to a problem. Now you pick between them, you can weigh the pros and cons. It's not just one versus the other, or just one and you're making a case for it. And I think this helps you to kind of, okay, well, if we did this one, we would get more of those, because this is kind of the trade-off thing again. Whereas if we do it a bit more this way, maybe we have some other consequences. So yeah, that's what I would do.
Oh, that's an interesting point that at least I have learned, that try to have 3 solutions to a problem, and then see which one is the potential one based on the pros and cons. And yes, I mean, that would be, I think, best way to approach any problem. And since we are talking about pros and cons, right? So, and in the beginning also, I mean, I spoke about maybe we are not sure whether we should call it as a framework or a model or a tool. So I'm sure, I mean, our listeners would have many such misconceptions about Spotify. So would you like to talk about misconceptions that you have come across related to this Spotify model?
Sure. So I think there's a couple of things. I think the main thing is that a lot of what I see people doing is, I've kind of said this a bunch of times already, but basically we don't understand the problem that we're solving. I have a talk that I've been doing for a while now called Beyond Copy Paste Agile. It's on YouTube. Yes. I think you've seen it as well. And the talk, of course, has evolved as any good talk or any good product will. It's changed over time. But the main kind of point of it was to try to respond to this thing where people say, oh, well, we want to go and copy Spotify. And, I understand it. Like, someone does something cool out there. You want some of what they've done. But the question is, do you have the problem that they have? And the way that I tell the story there is that I have this story that I open with where I say, this kid is watching their parents cooking dinner, making a roast. And the kid, of course, as you know, kids, their favorite question always is to ask why. So at some point, what happens is the parents take the roast and they put it into the roasting pan. But just before they do that, they cut a piece off the top of the piece of meat and put it into the pan. And then the kid says, well, why do you do this? Parents look at each other, I don't know. We learned this from our parents. So they go ask the grandparents and they say, well, we don't know. We learned this from our parents. And this carries on a few more times. And for the sake of the story, everyone is still alive, but they find the great grandparents and they say to them, well, what happened? And they say, well, my dears, when we got married, we didn't have a lot of money. We didn't have a very big oven or a very big house. And so the only way to fit that piece of meat into the pan was to cut a piece off and save it for later. And the point for me of this is I like it kind of as a story and a joke, but I think very often what's happening is that these ideas get passed down through the generations, but they're copied from one group to another without understanding the problem. So if you don't have a small oven, you don't need to cut a piece off the roast, right? And yet companies are doing this all the time. And so for me, one of the common things with this is the idea of chapters, which is really the matrix function. It's not a new or novel concept. Lots of companies have used it for various reasons before. But in the Spotify context, my understanding of the main reason why we chose to use it was because if you start today in a group that is growing really fast and you have a manager who is inside that team, now 6 weeks down the line, you move to another team because the area is bigger, you get a new manager, right? And so every single time you're moving around, to illustrate the point, I knew somebody who had 3 managers before they even started. So from interview to first day, they had 3 different managers before they started at the company, right? So the idea was basically like, Ramya, you might be my manager and you stay my manager for the next 2 years because as I move around, you're not stuck in one team, you span across multiple teams. This, I would argue, makes sense in a context where the team structure is changing constantly or you're hiring a lot of new people. However, if you're not, and you're in a very stable environment, you run the risk that you actually have 3 or 4 or 5 different managers for a single team because, every different specialization is managed by a different person. Then maybe you have a product manager or product owner or something. Maybe you have somebody like a coach or you have some designer or whatever. So now we end up with all these different channels of input who are not really in the team. They're somewhat sort of half in, half out, and it gets a little bit confusing. So in that case, I might consider, maybe choosing a different approach, much more like the traditional engineering manager or some kind of, tech lead, team lead, something like this. And I think a lot of people are quite surprised when I say like parts of Spotify had this as well. It depends on the context that you're operating in. And so I would say, take a look at this. The other thing that I would say that I find intriguing about the Spotify model is how many people buy it from companies and from consultants who never spent time at Spotify. I find it really strange. McKinsey is selling the Spotify model, but as far as I know, none of the people who sell that model worked at Spotify. So I don't really know how you can know how the company worked in order to kind of capture these ideas. And I realized that there's a little bit of a funny thing in there because I work there and I help companies with these types of challenges. But it's extremely rare that what I'm doing is telling them you should do what we did at Spotify. What I usually do is say, here's how we thought about it, given, maybe the teams like I just did with the chapters versus engineering manager thing. What problem space are you in? Like, where would you find yourself on that spectrum? Because if you're over here, these kind of solutions probably make a lot of sense. But if you're over here, they make no sense at all. And so this is why I keep talking about this idea of understanding the problem that you have and what somebody like myself, and there's plenty of other people who can do this, not just from Spotify. You've seen a range of different things done. And so you can present it like, here is your set of options, or here's a set of options that I've experienced before. What do you think might make some sense, rather than, here's your one solution, you should buy this and install it right now, it'll make everything go away. I'm very skeptical of silver bullet type solutions. There's a lot more nuance in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a disaster in making if we are trying to copy paste, what someone has done and successfully, have got the outcomes, and we are trying to replicate it in our own context. And I'm not sure how much true it is. Even Spotify, they themselves have stopped using Spotify as a model. They have moved beyond that. I'm not sure whether it is true or false, but yes, if you're trying to, sell something, maybe not even Spotify as a model, or even any framework within the agile setup, saying that, yeah, this will work for you in this context. I think that is definitely a red flag for organizations, or even for teams picking up those based on what consulting organizations are suggesting it. And yes, while we are onto that point, I have a question around this: is, do you think Spotify model can thrive beyond a tech companies. Obviously, whatever examples that we have heard about is till now is, most of the tech companies have implemented it or have got some outcomes out of this. Do you think it can move beyond tech companies as well?
So I think what I think is interesting to try to say copy, but I use that sort of as a loose term. The idea of having a culture that can evolve and continuously learn and change the way the organization works, to me, makes quite a lot of sense, especially if you're trying to respond to sort of evolving needs. Let's say you have different customers, you have new technology, you're expanding and growing into different markets, you're doing mergers and acquisitions, all of these kind of things. There is some differences between how you work today and how you want to work in the future. And so what I think is interesting is to build the capability to start to recognize where is the limit to what we currently do? Like, when does it stop working? How do we then come up with meaningful changes to address the issues that we're seeing? And how do we tell if those things are now starting to work so that we can maybe amplify them or spread the practice? But also, if they're not working, we want to kind of shut them down. Because I see a lot of companies, and I've worked at a lot of companies where, you arrive and you're like, hey, we do this big dashboard report thingy, whatever. And it's like, what is this for? Oh, if you ask a few questions, you find out, well, that was for an executive who actually left 6 years ago, but we still build this dashboard, we maintain the reporting. Like, what are we doing this for? Nobody else is looking at this anymore. And so, you have this kind of legacy both in software and you have it in organizational cultures. And so I think both the ability to, sort of validate or find the problems that you're solving, but also look for things that maybe have passed their sell-by dates or no longer useful. And the funny thing is that if you can create an environment where you can do this, you will be somewhat emulating what Spotify was trying to do, and also what a lot of startups are trying to do. And I think this kind of an approach, I mean, maybe you don't change quite as often if you're a legal firm because, things don't change necessarily at the same pace. But maybe if you're, maybe I don't understand law firms well enough and they actually do change really fast, in which case something that is much more fast-paced, adaptive might work. But still, when something shifts and something moves, I mean, a great example of this was, COVID-19, which everybody went through. Lots of issues and problems that it caused, but really what we saw every company able to do was suddenly focus and fix the problem of no one could speak to each other. How are we going to work?
Correct.
Well, we got Zoom, we got Teams, we got Meet, we got all these kind of tools. We had Slack suddenly. Most organizations within the space of about 6 to 12 weeks were able to, I don't say solve the problem, but go from nothing to something that was roughly workable. And so what we've done is we've demonstrated that companies actually, regardless of the industry, they can respond quite fast to change when they need to. It's a choice, and it's a tool that you can use when you want to be fast at something. Turns out, if you put people's focus on it and you make it the number one thing, it gets done. It's not rocket science, but we could use this. And I think across industries, this is often a valuable thing if we use it in the right places.
Absolutely. And speaking about, I'm just going back to your talk on do not copy paste agile, right? So the moment I saw the example that you explained, just now about cooking that maybe chicken, right? I was sold. That was it. The moment I saw that, I was like, wow, this is making so much sense. We don't even ask questions nowadays that why are we even doing what we are doing, right? So that is such a fundamental thing. And for an example, on a similar lines, you also spoke about maybe doing some report, which for some manager who is not even in the organization anymore. So speaking about that, that clicked me or that brought me to the next thing is that since we are talking about Spotify, obviously there would be some sorts of measures of doing or measuring our success on, right? So beyond just a traditional KPI, how does Spotify measure success within its squad? What are some unique metrics that they use?
I saw all variety of things in my time there. The things that I like most are the things that are closest to the thing that the customer cares about. So if you can get to a point where you're measuring some kind of meaningful impact to a customer, internal or external customer, right? So if you're building an internal tool or platform, maybe you have something like some sort of feedback from the users rating how good is the product at certain things. You could look at things like availability, how well does it solve the problem, this kind of thing. But I think we need a combination of like the hard numbers, like the qualitative metrics, and the quantitative, which is much more like how do we feel about this, or the story that we can tell, or the sort of general impact. Do people love and promote the product, or do they secretly tell everybody it sucks and they shouldn't use it? This, of course, means that the teams would need to be organized around some kind of product, which is not always the case. But I think if you're doing, say, IT support or hiring, probably you want to get a rating, for a hiring team in HR, maybe from the candidates, maybe from the hiring managers, and maybe from some other folks within the HR space to say, well, how well are we doing at hiring? And have some kind of a feedback loop that says, okay, well, we could improve this or we could improve that. I think the challenge is that when we try to take the approach of just locking in a target and saying, well, this is now the measure forever and ever, and then it's done, usually it turns into something a little bit like the executive dashboard that I was talking about just now. Maybe not quite as useful or not as currently beneficial. And so, yeah, I think it's helpful to explore and evolve and have an ongoing conversation around it until you feel quite comfortable that it's a good thing. And I think in the absence of that, people often try to measure, a number of stories delivered or velocity or something like this. And I really struggle with these metrics because I think they're not like, if the thing that you wanted was actually more stuff, it would be because of a reason. Are you trying to make, is it money? Is it happy customers? Is it faster time to market? What is the thing you care about? So let's try to put that front and center. The hard part, of course, is that, if you do something today, you don't necessarily make money today. You might make money over here in the future. So you need a little bit of like a history of it. But you could look at indicators on things like, well, if we're delivering things on a frequent basis to the market, if the lead time is roughly around about this, that would be, it would mean that we could be more responsive. But I would look at those things kind of more generally, and I don't think it's often helpful to judge the team based on those things because the environment tends to, there's a whole lot of things we could say about metrics, but I think the thing that is healthy is to try to make it as close to something that the customer will feel, ideally including customer feedback as well.
Oh yes, that's bang on. I would say in terms of what we are trying to measure over here for the customer. Again, velocity, story points, or this becomes our team level data, which might not be obviously it's never relevant in terms of measuring the success for a team. Obviously, it becomes more important to measure the success in terms of what value we are creating for the customer, maybe in terms of the business outcome for them, how this team has helped them achieve more business. That becomes one of the relevant data. Or maybe how successful we are able to deliver the value in terms of the time taken to do it, right? Maybe something in terms of mean time to recovery, in terms of if something goes down onto the production environment, that becomes one of a relevant information or a radiator for the team to evaluate their own
Very
success.
much so.
And we know that we have come to the to the last section, and we know that we have exceeded our time box too. But before we close out, Cliff, one last question that we would like to get to know from you here is, as an agile coach in a Spotify model, what are some key takeaways that you would like to share with our listeners as a closing note?
So I think part of the challenge with a lot of these things is that we often get overconfident that we found the right solution. And I would be able to tell you some really crazy stories about the number of times where I thought I'd found the right answer and, maybe overly confident, but then something changed and I realized that that's not, relevant anymore. I think the most important thing really is to stay curious. And that means being open to the idea of being wrong. It also means being open to the idea of being right. It's both. And yeah, being comfortable with the fact that like I can take my opinions outside, and maybe like you would clean a rug, beat them with a stick every once in a while, and go, yeah, let's give it a good solid testing. Is this actually still a good opinion? And I think by asking questions and staying in that curious stance, it enables us to like at least keep our mind open to the fact that there could be a different context in which it works, or a better way of doing it in the future, or something that we can learn. And so yeah, I think curiosity is perhaps the most important thing. I mean, when I grew up, we were told that there were a certain number of planets, and now we're told that Pluto is no longer a planet. And this was not considered something that you might think would change. And so many things. I mean, cell phones, I'm not even, oh, I'm 40. I'm not even that old, really. But like the internet, cell phones, now we've got AI and, all kinds of things that are different in our lives. And those things are evolving and changing. Our understanding of neuroscience, human beings, what makes companies work, all of this, it's evolving fast. And I think the best thing to do is keep an open mind and be curious and prepared to shift when new information arises.
Oh wow, talk about curiosity, and we can give so many things. I mean, that I think for me is a fodder. I mean, I take curiosity as my fodder. With just because of our curiosity, this entire podcasting also was born. So yes, I mean, talk about curiosity, and we can go on and on. And at least with this conversation today, what I learned the most is, I mean, one of the biggest myths that I had about Spotify that got busted today is Spotify, I mean, the organization came up with their own ways of working within the organization, and they called it as okay, this is our way of working in our organization. This is how we operate. And that worked best for them, and that they called it as maybe Spotify model or a framework, or maybe that's the Spotify ways of working. But for others outside Spotify, they treated as, I mean, this was a success story, and now they have some different ways of working. Let's call it as a Spotify model and try to implement it. And as you mentioned that, I mean, people are just trying to copy paste it left, right, and center without understanding any nuances of it. So it I mean, I feel that if I have to give maybe one piece of advice to our listeners about whatever little I have learned from Spotify is that treat this as any other framework that we have. And I mean, see what you can pick up from this framework, which will fit your context and which will solve the right problems. And if yes, then maybe go ahead and copy paste it. If no, then pick up some aspects and try to figure out what other things you can add to make it work for you. So am I right in maybe summarizing this?
I would say that the what I would add to what you've just said is that the most important piece is to invest more energy than I see most people doing in understanding the current context. And that means both what's working and what's not working, and understanding the patterns behind that. And I think that is really where I would advise people to start, is getting a better understanding of that, because once you can get a sense of the current context, it's much easier to then figure out what you should do about it. But we skip over this a lot, and we I look at it from my view and I go, this is the answer. But as soon as I talk to you and say, hey, I'm seeing this thing, do you see this? You go, no, I don't see that. Oh, okay, that's interesting. Then I talk to Vivek and he goes, yeah, well, actually, I see something else as well. And then you're like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And now we start to build up a more sensible picture of what's going on. And so I want to encourage people to do more of that. And once you're feeling quite comfortable that you understand the current state, then start looking for solutions. Don't do it the other way around.
Oh wow. I mean, that's a great piece of advice. I think that's a great piece of advice for practicing Agile in general. I mean, not just Spotify, just doing Agile in general. I mean, try to figure out what is working and what is not working, and then try to find out what can be done to fit this context. That's an amazing point to end on. Thank you so much, Cliff, for your time today. I have definitely learned a lot, and so many of my myths got busted with this conversation. We are looking forward to more such conversation with you and learn more from you. And I know that there are so many topics that you have to offer, especially on the flight thing that you mentioned, right? I know there are three S that we got on that, and I'm very curious to curious to learn more on that. Maybe in the next podcast episode. So for today, thank you so much for joining us. It was great talking to you.
Cool.
Thank you, Cliff.
Sure. I would just say if anyone wants to reach out and chat further, you can find me either on my website. So my name, cliffhazell.com. Otherwise, you can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm posting almost every day my thoughts and what I'm learning, things that I'm reading and exploring and so on. So feel free to follow along, and you're most welcome to drop me a message and have a chat if you'd like to explore something a bit further.
Yes, and we are also going to add your handles and website link as well in this episode that when we publish it out. So yes, people can reach out to you using that link as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much for watching this episode patiently till the end. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll meet you again in the next episode. Till then, if you like our podcast show, then do like, share, subscribe, and let us know your feedback in the comment section. You can also listen to the episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Audible. Thank you.